For a long time, the people who wrote about Africa's past were mostly Eurocentric Africanists. These Western historians acted like experts on African history, but they often tried to change and control the African story. Theophile Obenga, a respected African scholar and master linguist, showed how these Eurocentric views were full of biases and dishonesty. One of the most vocal Eurocentric Africanists was Theophile Obenga. He had a hard time understanding why Cheikh Anta Diop, a prominent African historian, didn't seek fame or academic recognition. Diop was dedicated to African history and his people, which was very different from Eurocentric Africanists who chased after fame and awards. Theophile Obenga's critique of Diop showed his struggle to accept African intellectuals as equals. Eurocentric Africanists have always been adept at using words in tricky ways. For example, Theophile Obenga was confused about calling African scholars Africanists. Theophile Obenga rightfully pointed out that it was absurd to call African scholars Afrocentrist Africanists. For example, an English professor of English and English civilization at the University of London, of English origin, is not an Anglicist, but an English researcher. This manipulation of words made African scholarship seem less important and objective. As Africans and people of African descent, it is important to note that Cheikh Anta Diop's work helped Africans across the world connect with their history. This wasn't just academic work. It was about reclaiming identity. Eurocentric Africanists didn't grasp this because their views were based on dividing and exploiting African history. Next, we will examine the debunking of the so-called Greek miracle. Paul Cartledge admitted that Europeans finally understood the complexities of ethnicity and multiculturalism in world history. He reluctantly acknowledged the Kemetic or Egyptian influence on Greek civilization. Martin Bernal's work, which showed how Egyptian culture influenced Greece, challenged the long-held belief in the Greek miracle. Theophile Obenga was very firm in his criticism of how Eurocentric scholars resisted accepting these connections because it threatened their sense of superiority. After the exposure of the plans of Western scholars, they formed a new field of African scholarship. The so-called New Africanism scholars like Theophile Obenga and others set a new trap for African history. They pretended to fix past mistakes, but still held on to their power. Ethnographic studies were updated but remained stuck in colonial thinking. Theophile Obenga, our master linguist, compared this to expecting a mango tree to grow coconuts. It just wouldn't happen. These strategies kept African scholars defending their history instead of freely exploring it. It is worth noting that Eurocentric Africanists wanted to keep their control over the narrative. Obenga's criticism of their research exposed their psychological, semantic, and intellectual tricks. In a way, Obenga laid the foundation for us to challenge these biases and reclaim African history from those who distorted it. Eurocentric historians claim their work was objective, meaning it was free from bias. They presented their stories as the ultimate truth while dismissing other perspectives as biased. Theophile Obenga dismantled this myth, showing the deep prejudices that colored their views of African history. Historians like Clarence Walker and Pascal Vernus often claimed their critiques of African scholars were unbiased. Walker's critique of Molefi Kete Asante's work was full of misunderstandings. Obenga showed how African scholars weren't making up history. They were simply reclaiming it from colonial suppression. Henry Tourneur's work on African historical linguistics showed how far Eurocentric Africanists would go to keep their dominance. Obenga exposed Tourneur's flawed arguments. Tourneur used outdated classifications like Hamitic to divide African languages. He sought to separate Kemet from the rest of Africa. This ignored the real connections across African languages and kept the colonial mindset alive. It is important to note that vocabulary is not just a list of words. It also reflects culture, society, and psychology. Here are some examples that show this connection between Kemet and the rest of Black Africa. Egyptian or Kemetic, Sem meaning priest, a figure who wore leopard skin attire. Priests in other African groups characteristically wore this leopard skin attire. Bambara, Sema meaning chief of cult. Malinka, Same meaning chief of cult. Kikongo, Sema meaning sanctify, honor, bless. Teke, Seme, meaning pray, sanctify. Fang, Sime, meaning worship, honor. There are countless linguistic similarities across various African languages. These examples show how similar words in different African languages connect to important cultural roles and practices in Kemet. Beatrix Midon-Reine used the concept of crossbreeding to explain Egyptian civilization. We have covered this lie in previous videos on this channel. Theophile Obenga argued this was scientifically and culturally wrong. It suggested that Africa's advancements came from outside. This view undermined Africa's own achievements and kept the myth that Africa was passive and dependent on others. Pascal Vernus made inaccurate comparisons between Egyptian and Semitic languages. Obenga criticized him for ignoring rigorous methods and picking similarities out of context. Vernus's approach created a false narrative that separated Egypt from the rest of Africa culturally and linguistically. The Afro-Asiatic language family hypothesis, despite lacking scientific proof, continues to be used by Eurocentric scholars. Obenga pointed out that even foremost scholars at the time, like Carlton T. Hodge, admitted that this language family was unproven. Yet, it is still being used to divide African history and reinforce the idea of a hierarchy with Europe at the top. The myth of objectivity was a powerful tool for Eurocentric historians to control African history. Obenga revealed their biases and flawed methods. By exposing these weaknesses, he defended African scholarship and called for a more honest approach to historiography that respected African history.
My name is Theophile Obenga. I came from Congo originally, from Central Africa, Congo. And now I teach at San Francisco State University. And my field of expertise is basically non-valley civilization, ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. I teach philosophy, linguistics, and Medu-nature. And which kind of language? They used to call that is Afro-Asiatic language. But this, there is no such thing like Afro-Asiatic family, because it's almost impossible to put together in the same family Semite language like Akkadian, Hebrew, Phoenician, Arabic, and then Berber and Kushat language and Egyptian language in the same family. Nobody can succeed. It's impossible to do that. When they do that, just pure ideology. There is no scientific fact, you see. So we remove the language, Kemet, Egyptian language, from this fake family called Afro-Asiatic family. In the United States, called also in France, basically they call that Camito-Semitic family. There was no such thing like that.
The battle for African history wasn't just about the past, it was about the present and future. Theophile Obenga's critique highlighted the need for African scholars to reclaim their history and assert their intellectual agency. Historical memory was crucial for identity and agency. Eurocentric scholars' erasure and distortion of African history left deep scars. Obenga emphasized reclaiming this memory as vital for African identity. Obenga called for going beyond Eurocentric narratives to embrace Africa's diversity. This required changing how history was taught and researched, challenging biases, and learning from African scholars. Afrocentric scholarship is key to reclaiming history. By centering African perspectives, it offers a more accurate understanding. Obenga highlighted the need to support these Afrocentric voices, recognizing their role in challenging Eurocentric views of African history. This support should extend beyond academia to include cultural institutions and public discourse spaces such as YouTube. Reclaiming African history has profound implications for identity. It empowers Black individuals and communities, providing continuity, pride, and belonging. It challenges stereotypes used to justify oppression. By asserting historical agency, Africans will redefine their place in the world. In the past, African scholars and intellectuals asserted that Africanists, who were once in control of educating and influencing African elites, had lost their influence and needed to recognize a paradigm shift in the writing of African history. African intellectuals fought against the intellectual dominance and cultural arrogance of Eurocentric Africanists. emphasizing that these scholars did not understand Africa's issues better than Africans themselves. They particularly opposed the Africanists' sense of superiority and underlying racism. African scholars rejected derogatory labels like primitivism and Afrocentrism that Eurocentric Africanists used to demean African perspectives. They advocated for terms like Pan-Africanism, African unity, and African Renaissance, viewing them as essential for political, economic, cultural, and historical progress. The stance of Africanist studies was criticized for being negative and dismissive of African cultural unity, historical consciousness, and the African Renaissance. African scholars refuted the notion that pharaonic Egypt was anything but an African civilization, arguing that it was built by Black Africans and that its language was related to other African languages. Our scholars highlighted the contributions of Africans in various fields, from art and literature to science and philosophy, both historically and in modern times. They pointed out the achievements of notable African scientists and intellectuals, showing that Africans had excelled globally, despite the biases of Eurocentric Africanism. In conclusion, African intellectuals called for an end to the racist and Eurocentric approach of Africanist studies. They emphasized the importance of mutual respect, human dignity, and cooperation, urging a move away from outdated colonial stereotypes and towards recognizing the true value and contributions of African civilizations and people. They aspired to a future where the achievements of all humanity, regardless of race, were acknowledged and celebrated. Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.